Advocacy is reinforced by powerful research and data. It is more quickly met with meaningful action. This session will cover the global research conducted by ManpowerGroup and a local study underway from the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. Presenters will also share the stories behind the decisions to take these steps and impact of their work. While there are definitely strides being made that we know that certain communities of color can still fall between the cracks for gender and people of color initiatives, especially with the global operating organizations that we know of. This is why we are here today and the discussion we will guide with each and every one of you. To my immediate right, I have the distinct privilege of being on stage with some amazing and dynamic individuals, of whom have personally shaped me in my professional and personal career, whether they know it or not. You know, one has known me since I was 7 years old, to one who is recently definitely the reason why I'm back home here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And an individual who, from afar, I've always admired his passion and his ability to convene a room with the right players to get things done. And so I am delighted to be on stage with them, and I'm equally excited for them to share their background and their perspectives. So just because I know all of them personally, I don't want to take for granted that you do, which I'm pretty sure you're definitely familiar. But to give respect and honor where honor and respect is due, I'll give a brief background of our panelists for this afternoon. We'll begin with Genyne Edwards, partner of P3 Development Group. Genyne Edwards is an experienced consultant and attorney who has worked in community development and social enterprise for more than 15 years. She specializes in building partnerships and coalitions, managing and staffing projects, and conducting research. Ms. Edwards co-led the research conducted by the MMAC on diverse talent, of which we'll hear more about in a few moments. Christopher Rowland, Global Diversity Officer at ManpowerGroup. Chris Rowland oversees the advancement of ManpowerGroup's long-term D&I strategy and execution. He collaborates with the senior leadership team to implement culture and talent strategies that leverage diversity and inclusion across the company's 80 countries and territories and throughout the ManpowerGroup family of brands. Last but definitely not least, we have Tim Sheehy, President of Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. As president of the MMAC, Tim represents approximately 1,800 member businesses with 300,000 employees in Milwaukee, Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee counties and beyond. Mr. Sheehy spearheaded the organization's research initiative to gain insights into Milwaukee's diverse talent. And this, ladies and gentlemen, will begin our discussion, and we'll ask Mr. Tim Sheehy to begin the conversation with presenting the background.
Sure, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to do this. So what I'm going to do very briefly is share with you the most recent journey that we're on working with employers and others in the community to make sure that Milwaukee is a region of choice for diverse talent. Genyne is one of the consulting teams that is working on this project, and Chris has been kind enough to volunteer his time and sit on a steering committee that we have overseeing this. And I also want to recognize Julie Granger, our Executive Vice President, who's really leading this project for us. So this is really an outgrowth of an experience I had at the African American Leadership Conference. I've lived in Milwaukee most of my adult life. I came out of that conference setting like I had been punched in the heart. It was really a deep experience listening to how people live in Milwaukee, how they feel they're treated in Milwaukee, and the experiences they have in their companies. So as we heard a question from our speaker this morning, just a moment ago, about using data and emotion. So I clearly had the emotion coming out of there. What I didn't have was the data. So what we started on as a project I'm going to walk through very briefly, and we looked at, and I know this is not inclusive of all diversity, but we looked at African American and the Latino population here in Milwaukee, and we compared against 20 other markets around the United States using these 7 measures of prosperity. So you can see them up there. I won't walk through all of them, but we wanted a good representation of prosperity and living in a community. And then what we did was we took the prosperity measures and we added them up. And the simplest way for me to explain this is like a golf score, okay? Lower is better. And so if you ranked high, in this case, on African American prosperity, across those 7 rankings, your community would have, you know, a 1 ranking, a 2 ranking, or a 3 ranking. And the number on the bottom, you can see from Milwaukee, shows that of these comparative markets, the prosperity for African Americans was the lowest. In other words, they had the worst prosperity ranking compared to these peer markets. So we did the same thing for the Hispanic community, and while it was a bit better, it was still on the bottom, where Milwaukee ranked 21st out of 20 comparable markets in terms of the prosperity of the Hispanic community. We then did it for the white community in terms of the prosperity ranking, and you see Milwaukee does relatively well here. We ranked 6th best out of the 21 communities or 20 communities we were comparing against. And then very quickly we did a gap analysis. So what is the gap between the African American and white community here? And you can see Milwaukee had the largest gap, which was also true with the Hispanic community. So this data tells us that Milwaukee, and this may not be news to anybody in this room, has a significant disparity challenge. And when you look at this, those numbers don't mean much in terms of what they stand for, but if you look at this data and just look at how this would compare if Milwaukee could be more like Raleigh. So the percent of African American managers would grow from 3.6% to 5.1%. Those with bachelor's degrees, 31% versus 15%. Unemployment would drop. Owner-occupied housing would almost double, and the poverty rate would fall almost in half. So when you take these prosperity rankings and look at what Milwaukee could be, you can see real gains here. So we then said, look, we're a business organization, we represent employers. We're going to need the community to change, but we also need the workplace to change. So let's look at how firms in Milwaukee rank. And so this is a data set from companies, all companies in the Metro Milwaukee area with 100 or more employees, EEOC data. And you can see that Milwaukee has about 3,000 diverse management employees. But compared to where we could be and where we should be, you can see we rank relatively low in the percentage of our workforce in management that is African American or Hispanic. So we took this data, which clearly puts Milwaukee behind, and we recruited 30 companies to kind of pioneer this work that we're doing that I'm going to wrap up just explaining here in a second so we can continue to have a discussion. But we recruited these companies. They employ about 100,000 people in the Metro Milwaukee area here, and we asked them to do 3 things. We asked them to reach out to their diverse management talent to participate in a survey. We asked them to help us recruit that diverse management talent to participate in a series of focus group discussions. And we asked their CEOs to participate in an interview. So this is part of the work that Genyne and her team are leading. And as we walk through this, we've had, I think, a really outstanding turnout. We got more than 1,000 participants on the survey, and so that represents almost 1/3 of the folks employed participated in the surveys. And as we got going on this, we also picked up about 30,000 employees participating in the public sector. So the city, we've got the city involved, the county involved, the sewage district, the public school system, and the technical college. I'm listening to Julie nod her head, make sure I got this right. So we have a robust participation from large private sector employees also. In addition to this, of the 1,000 that participated, almost half volunteered to participate in these focus group discussions. And I think, oh, that's fine, I don't want to go there yet. So I'm going to quit here, but I think, Genyne, we have about 300 folks that agreed to participate, and you've had about 150 or so participate in the focus group discussions.
Correct.
So this is where we are in the journey, and obviously this is not an endpoint, this is data, and the big question everybody has is, what are you going to do with the data? And so that's what we're in the process of doing. The next steps will be to engage the folks that participated in the focus group and surveys. We're going to engage them in 2 town hall sessions. We want to make sure that what we captured is what they told us, and we want to make sure there's nothing missing. And we want to ask their opinion about what we should be doing. And then our next step is to share this back with the Chief Human Resources and Chief Diversity Officers of the companies to get their feedback. And then we're going to take it to our board, which is made up of the CEOs of these companies and other companies. And our objective is to come out of here with a very specific game plan that helps change the workplace environment that exists here in Milwaukee, and then to participate with other organizations to help make some of the changes in the community. So I'm going to stop there because I think part of the discussion is going to be a little bit of what we heard from the surveys and focus groups without getting ahead of where we are. And so I think this is a decent setup to carry the conversation on.
Absolutely. And I just have one follow-up question as it pertains to the study and the background that you shared, Tim. Can you share a little bit more in depth, whether it was your role as president of the MMAC and or going through the data thus far, the relationship that you see between inclusion and talent recruitment and retention?
Yeah, so there's two parts to the answer to that question. A year ago or so, we survey our board periodically, and we asked 2 questions. From your perspective, running your business here in Milwaukee, what are our best assets and what are our biggest liabilities? And this last survey we got back, the biggest liability was the racial disparity and lack of diversity. And it's not like they just discovered this as an issue. I'm just saying it came up on the top of the list. So that really solidified this as an issue that we need to dig in if we're going to keep this region globally competitive. And the second part to this answer, or the second part to the answer to the question is, if I look ahead the next 10 years, which we're charged with doing for the region, not only is the city, which already is majority minority, but in the next decade, the entire region becomes majority minority. So if Milwaukee doesn't develop and retain the talent, the diverse talent that it has, I don't know how it's going to compete globally. And we've got to get that right if we're going to recruit and retain people who aren't from Milwaukee here. So if this wasn't clear from the survey with the business community, it's very clear to me in terms of what this community is going to look like, and we have to reflect that in our economy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And so we looked at the data that Tim just shared and the percentage of management. We saw 14% for white, 3.6% for African Americans, and 4.9% for Hispanic. By a show of hands, how many of you thought that was spot on from what you experience and see day to day? By a show of hands, who was very much alarmed and taken aback by the percentage and seeing the data? And this is definitely a safe space. We talked about that throughout with the keynote speaker. And so I'm going to toss this to both Genyne and Chris, because everyone here has a different perspective and lens, not just because of your cultural and gender makeup, but even through your professional experiences as well. So Tim used the words gut punched when he...
Heart punch.
Heart punch. Thank you for correcting me. Heart punch. And so as a Milwaukee native and being a master convener for coalitions, I wanted you to talk about a little bit of your reaction to the data. And then Chris, for someone who has come to Milwaukee, but has spent a wide range of your career in recruitment, but also now leading, being the Chief Diversity Officer for ManpowerGroup, I wanted to get your immediate reaction as well. Genyne?
Sure. So part of my immediate reaction is I think I'm more shocked just by the total number of managers that are operating, not necessarily the experience of African American and Latino professionals who are working. As part of my leadership journey, I've been able to be involved with the premier African American leadership experience in Milwaukee, the African American Leadership Program. As we celebrated our 10-year of programming last year, it's been the individual testimony of leaders who've gone through that experience, who have shared, who have cried, who have opened up, who have expressed frustration of working in sectors and in organizations where they are not seen, where they are not heard, and where oftentimes they're not respected. So although I've had that real life experience of knowing and hearing what those experiences have been like, I still was very shocked to know that that number is so low. Because, you know, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, okay, yeah, we see these few, the 20 cohort members that show up, but there's gotta be more people out there. There are probably people that we just haven't seen or that they're hiding in plain sight. So I think for me, it definitely stood out to me that we have a lot of room, but 3.6% was pretty shocking for me for the African American manager makeup.
Chris?
Yeah. For myself, being a transplant, you know, there's a couple observations regarding Milwaukee, but to speak specifically on the data, I would say I was not at all surprised, given not only looking internally within our organization, but with our partnering companies that we work with. And as you mentioned to start, we work with over 400,000 companies globally and tens of thousands within the US. Those numbers and those percentages seem about accurate. And so there's certainly an opportunity there, but I am certainly encouraged, and I want to go back to what Tim said, because I don't want to lose sight of that. I think it's so powerful that this is a time where CEOs are taking this really seriously and identifying that this is one of the challenges. And we'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about the surveys that we do at ManpowerGroup around talent and supply and demand. But organizations are realizing that this is one of, if not the challenge for organizations to thrive and remain sustainable. And so I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by our community kind of taking up the sword on that and addressing the problem, head on. I think it's a really good place to be, to start the discussion.
Absolutely. And so for Genyne, Tim talked about how the MMAC's work was inspired by a 3-day strategy session on African American leadership. Can you tell the story and talk about the momentum that has been building on this particular issue?
Sure. So back in May of 2017, and this is really an outgrowth of the African American Leadership Program and the key learnings that myself and Dr. Jeanette Mitchell, who I believe is in the room, Dr. Mitchell, who is the founder of the African American Leadership Program, have really, over the 10 years, I mentioned we have about 20 people in each cohort. So you have the opportunity to really shape and grow and have a transformational experience with 20 leaders. But about the beginning of 2017, as we are starting to think about the 10-year journey and what next steps might be, we started to ask questions like, how will we sustain this work? What can we be doing differently? How should we be thinking about this more from a systems perspective? And that really led us to try to explore what we feel was more of a visioning conversation in the form of a 3-day strategic actioning session. What that session looked like was about 75 cross-sector leaders coming together to really focus in on the topic of sustainable African American leadership. And it was diverse by sector, by intergenerational diversity, gender diversity, and also diversity from race and ethnicity. What stood out from the experience was, although many African American leaders know each other and we have the ability to work together on issues, there were many of those cross-sector leaders who had never seen each other, had never met each other. And also the allies that were in the room, I think what stood out to them is many of the people who they work with on a day-to-day basis, sit on boards and committees with, they'd never heard that firsthand real experience, an authentic conversation about how painful it is oftentimes being the only or the other. And so it was a transformational experience, but what came out of that 3-day session was the drive to create a strategic agenda that could be championed by those 75 and then taken into the larger community. So over the last year, in 2018, we spent a year really creating a foundation for what is now called the African American Leadership Alliance Milwaukee. It has not been perfect. There have been fits and starts, and one of the biggest challenges has been to continue to keep people at the table, to keep this issue at the forefront. But what has stood out is that we definitely at a place where the timing is right and that people have agreed that this is something that we will continue to convene around. We've created a board of directors and created a 501c3 organization, and are testing out a new model for leadership for this organization, and are poised now in 2019 to do things like this, right? Sit on the panel and talk a little bit about what the journey has been and how we hope to be able to take this work into the future.
Thank you. And so, Chris, can you tell us more about the model that ManpowerGroup has outlined that companies can implement?
Yeah, absolutely. And, piggybacking on what Genyne said, I think there's so much wisdom there in terms of how you coordinated and brought folks together from different sectors and verticals within the community. And a lot of that can be replicated within organizations. Following on the backs of the keynote, we, about 5 years ago, actually did a survey. We surveyed 22 leaders, both within our organization, a third in our organization, and 2/3 externally outside of our organization, to really come up with and identify some solutions to really moving the discussion along. I think it was brought up in a comment, so long the discussion has been around awareness and understanding, and there was certainly a need for that. But how do we really move to commitment? How do we really move to action and kind of evolve the conversation along? And so I bring up Genyne's point because one of the things is really looking at diversity as really a holistic solution and an ecosystem to drive progress. was mentioned it, but D&I cannot be regulated to the Office of D&I, can't be regulated to HR. It has to not only collaborate with, but engage with other functions, other business leaders, and really address it as a business priority. And so certainly within ManpowerGroup, that's something that we've looked to build, to create that safe space, look to engage leaders, and not always just the leaders who are passionate and who are ambassadors. I heard a comment about those leaders who may be a little rough around the edges or may not get it, the light hasn't clicked on. I think taking a step towards those individuals, be it breaking bread or building relationships to really help them to have that aha moment is something that we've really focused on. But I did want to talk about a couple of the insights from the survey. And again, to echo, no, there is no silver bullet. We know that there's no single solution. It's a sophisticated challenge and problem, and so it's going to require a sophisticated solution. But we did identify a couple strategic themes that have really boded well for not only us internally, but also externally with our clients. I talked a little bit about kind of the holistic approach and creating this diversity ecosystem. The second one I would say is leadership has to own it. It has to be authentic, and it has to come from the top. Within our organization, it starts from our board. We have very proud of our board of directors, which is over 40% female, and from a diversity perspective, about 30%. They hold our CEO accountable, and from there, our CEO holds our presidents of each of our 80 countries accountable to driving diversity and inclusion. So it's got to start from the top. Leadership's got to own it. If the leaders need to have some aha moments, then again, it comes back to how do you reach them and interact with them. Be explicit. For a while, there was a little bit of a theme that people were uncomfortable with quotas or targets, and so there was a move away from that. But you can't change something that you don't measure, and you can't make progress or make actionable items on something that you don't measure. So again, having a disciplined focus, just as you would with a business priority, and being specific not only when, where, and what you want to change has certainly boded well. And then the third one that I would highlight is really this idea of promoting a culture of conscious inclusion. If you walk within the walls of a ManpowerGroup, you'll hear that quite a bit, and it doesn't take anything away from unconscious bias. Training and awareness of your biases, I think is important. It's a piece of the solution, not the solution. But we really look to build out this culture of conscious inclusion, and it's really moving from awareness again to action. And we do that through embedding D&I in all aspects of the business. So be it talent acquisition, be it learning and development, be it our workforce analytics, leveraging our BRGs and giving them a voice to talk to our leadership, be it our program managers and sales folks on the front lines. All those individuals are very solution-minded and solution-focused, so bring them in to be a part of the solution and co-build it and hold them accountable, and we've seen some great results from that.
Thank you. So Tim, Chris just shared some examples that ManpowerGroup is doing in this arena. But what if a company doesn't have the resources like ManpowerGroup or the MMAC? Being that you represent over 1,000, nearly 2,000 member businesses with over 300,000 employees, are there steps that can be taken to foster a more inclusive workplace?
Yeah, I don't think size is a barrier here. There may be some resource issues, but I'm going to say on the accountability end, what we're looking at is not to produce a report here. That's not going to get us anywhere. I look at those numbers and let's just round off and call it 3,000 diverse managers in these companies. If we come back next year and it's 3,002 and then it's 3,005, that's what I mean about holding ourselves accountable. That we have to see these numbers move, and we talked a lot today about talking about this. What we want to see is these numbers move. So I think companies can learn from each other. Size is not the issue, but can learn best practices, what's working, what's not working. I mean, in the survey again, without getting out ahead of this, we got a lot of feedback from people that my company has an ERG, but I think it's just there in name only. Or I don't see anybody else above me in the company that looks like me. So is this real? And so we've got to have some real proof points and some consequences. And I'll share one personal story. When I first came in as CEO of the organization of MMAC, our board was probably 99% white and 95% male. Okay.
Was anybody named John?
There were lots of Johns, I'm sure, on that board. But when I took over the organization, I didn't really think anything of that. It wasn't on my radar screen. I figured all the CEOs in this community are white. It's the CEOs in the community that sit on our board. So it didn't strike me as unusual, and I didn't really do much about it. And then one of our first diverse board chairs said to me, do you see, does this board look very diverse to you? And nobody really asked me that question before. And I said, no, I guess it doesn't. And he goes, well, isn't it part of your responsibility to make sure we have more diverse leaders on this board? And I said, you're right, it is. So we came back a year later for my annual review, and the board was still about 99% white and 95% male. And he said, you didn't make much progress. And I said, well, I tried really hard. I looked around. I really couldn't find any CEOs that were diverse or I thought could get on the board. He said, okay. And then he looked up and he said, you have a bonus. And I said, yeah, I know I do. And he said, next year, 30% of your bonus is going to be determined on the diversity of your board. I said, okay. Came back next year and he said, isn't it amazing how this works? Look at the progress you've made on diversifying your board. So my point is the good intentions and good thoughts are okay, but it was the consequence of making that a priority that helped deliver the change. And I think that's what we need to do is hold people accountable for good intentions to make things happen.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, the title of our session is Inclusion as a Measurable Business Imperative. With a growing amount of research validating that an inclusive workplace is good for a business's bottom line, I'm going to ask each of you to please provide your insight on why inclusion can be presented to deliver on business imperatives. Genyne, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think a lot of what we've already heard today really underscores the point, and I'll take just a little bit of liberty just to share some real high points from some of the focus group discussions that were held from the MMAC diversity study. What we heard loud and clear was that representation is one of the biggest issues. And so when you don't see representation as senior leadership, the idea that you can give your best and you can work towards something, right, towards the next role, the next position, and move up the ladder. For most individuals in the focus group, because they don't have that sight line, they're constantly trying to figure out where that next company is, where they can find representation and where they can find a career path. So what you have is this kind of revolving door of really talented, high performers who are moving from organization to organization, either in this region or outside of the region, to try to find a place that they can grow and they can lead. Is that amen corner?
Amen.
Thank you. So that was one point that was really underscored. So of course, that definitely affects the bottom line. You've kind of got this in the door, out the door, you're recruiting, and there's of course a cost to that. There's a financial cost, but there's also a human cost. In addition to that, I think one thing that we heard was that Milwaukee leadership and the bench is just really, really small. It's not deep enough. So although there are voices, ambassadors, when you have a Joaquin, a Genyne, a Danae, that are the constant voice of these issues and the imperative and the importance of this at board seats and at board table, it does not create enough opportunity for there to be other leaders who can champion this in their spaces. And because oftentimes this is a very kind of close-knit, small leadership group, it's the same individuals that are being invited over and over again. So oftentimes you have individuals who are either natives, but then also non-natives, who are trying to figure out, even in the community setting, where they can fit in and where their voice can be heard. But because oftentimes those seats for boards and committees are through relationships, it's usually a lot of the usual suspects that are tapped over and over again. And people are looking for those type of opportunities also in leadership. And then last but not least, and this really echoes Tim's point around the no teeth in diversity and inclusion. So I won't call out any names, but there were many people in these focus groups that are at corporations that tout successful D&I strategies, who are at the top of the list for the best of the best of class D&I. And quite honestly, individuals within those companies say it's lip service. There is not a commitment to diversity. They are not seeing the actions and the activities being taken within their organization that align directly with the representation of D&I strategy. And individuals are looking for there to be teeth, accountability, and more measurable results that move the organizations forward, and really looking for a culture shift within their organization. So all of those wrapped up really tied to that business imperative and the importance of, if we don't get this right, we're going to continue to lose talent, and they're just not going to stay here in the region.
Thank you. Chris, why inclusion can be presented to deliver on business imperatives?
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit from our expertise as a global workforce solutions employer. To piggyback on that, I think and some of the statistics were shared in terms of diversity leading to greater productivity, innovation, higher customer service, those sorts of things, and that's been proved over and over. I think McKinsey has done a study, Catalyst has done a number of studies. We've seen those. But from a pure world of work perspective, and Tim touched on this a little bit, we do 2 surveys every year. One is called our MEO survey. It's a Manpower Employee Outlook survey. So it measures the hiring intentions of corporations quarter to quarter. And actually, the last 2 quarters, we've seen the highest intentions that we've seen over the last decade. So contrary to what you may have heard about robotics and technology and robots taking jobs, actually employers are looking to hire, and they're looking to add headcount. They need it to thrive and to move forward. In addition to that, we do a talent shortage survey every year as well, and that measures the difficulty employers have in finding talent. And again, this year was the highest in the last 8 years that we've seen in terms of the difficulty level in finding talent. I think it was 46% of our employers globally, 46% in North America and 45% globally said that they had challenges finding talent. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion and the power that leveraging diverse talent pipelines and creating environments where those individuals can thrive, bring their best selves to work, diversity is at the center of that conversation. It's at the center of that talent challenge. We talk within our organization with clients quite a bit about this idea around skills revolution, and that the skills of tomorrow aren't the same as the skills of today. And so again, identifying diverse populations, helping them to upskill and be ready for the changing world of work and jobs of tomorrow are at the center, and make another case on why diversity and inclusion is so important and imperative for organizations in this day and age.
Thank you, Chris. Tim?
Yeah, I'm going to use my last slide up to make this point. I talked about the region, and in the next decade it becomes a majority minority. So the imperative of developing talent here, oops, I'm going the wrong way, I think. The imperative for developing talent here in the region is right in front of us. If you look at these statistics in terms of the percentage of Hispanic males that have a GPA under 2, African American males that have a GPA under 2, bachelor's degrees earned in the region, and the percentage of residents that are living in poverty here, these are business statistics. Yes, they're gathered from the community, but this is our future talent pool. And if we don't develop it, engage it, I don't know where companies in this community are going to find talent. And so we need to look inside our companies, but we also need to look to this community, and these numbers have got to change if we're going to be able to make a business case to an employer that you should locate here because you can be globally competitive.
Thank you for that. So we do know that there is a direct relationship between advocacy and meaningful action. How are each of you advocating across your respective platforms for positioning inclusion as a business case? And how are you taking meaningful action for intentional impact? Chris, I'll start with you.
There's a couple different avenues I kind of want to touch on. One, for me personally, it really is kind of that, going back to kind of that diversity ecosystem. So not only internally, but also working with clients, this idea of diversity being everyone's issue and all being part of the solution is one of the ways that I advocate and really drive accountability and create buy-in from individuals across the organization. So again, as I mentioned, be it within our business lines, be it within our functional areas, bringing folks in who are who have solution mindsets and are driven to create real business impact. Having those tough conversations, be it in a group setting, as Genyne mentioned, or a lot of times individually, one-on-one with our leaders in meetings, and helping them to understand we have to co-create the solution that will drive impact.
Genyne?
So I think I'll start first with the personal. The personal journey for me has been really a gift. I mean, I'm from Milwaukee, so I'm committed to making Milwaukee a better place. And in certain ways, because that's been a personal journey, and a lot of my personal and professional life overlaps quite a bit, I've made a personal commitment to re-up with organizations that are taking this very seriously. So organizations that 20 years ago I was involved with, like the Milwaukee Urban League Young Professionals, that really started me on this journey, I'm recommitting. So I'm becoming a member again. And I'm really ensuring that the data that I have and the subject matter expertise that I have, that I'm sharing it more broadly. And so hopefully, slide decks and information and things that sometimes pass across our desks or that we have access to, we haven't been intentional about thinking about how to share it broadly and intentionally with others. In addition to that, professionally, because I do think that there is a really unique opportunity that we have at this particular time, I'm really trying to figure out how to best position myself as a leader and also as a business owner to ensure that my business is aligned with this journey and this trajectory. And I really encourage, individuals who are in the room, if you are a leader, then you have to take a really close look at yourself. So that's a personal assessment. And are you aligning yourself and growing, taking more classes, reaching out, trying to figure out points of alignment, points of leverage, and points of connections with others that are in your network? And then last but not least, I had gone to a conference, the Forum on Workplace Inclusion, a year ago, and they had us do kind of a silly little test to really look at your diversity quotient. And it really was looking at who's in your leader network, right? Who are these people? How diverse are they? And me, kind of the queen of diversity and inclusion and the queen of leadership, you know, I took the test and I'm thinking, yeah, it's gonna be really great because of course I'm sitting at tables with many diverse leaders. But to be really honest, when it comes to my go-to network and my leadership network, it really is not that diverse, right? There's a lot of African American women on it. And so trying to be more intentional about trying to identify who here in Milwaukee is very interested in this. Coming out of the SAS, I made a commitment to all of the allies that were part of that process to go one-on-one and take a deeper dive. As a result of that, I've created a great relationship with Emily Phillips, just as an example, someone who I didn't know at the outset of that, and that now I have kind of this whole new set of friends and allies that are going to help me on my journey into the future. So I'm really excited about who I'm becoming as a result of embracing this D&I experience.
Thank you. Tim, how are you advocating across your platform to position inclusion as a business case and taking meaningful action for intentional impact?
So I think it's advocating, but I also think it's willing to be held accountable. So as I talked about those numbers, we're going to present those to our board every year and hold ourselves accountable as a part of this solution or as a part of this journey to make this a region of diverse talent. Last week, we were thrilled to participate. I see Nancy Hernandez in the back here, who is the new leader of the Hispanic Collaborative. And in most cases, we start an organization like that on its own and let it sit out in the community. In this case, we partner with the Hispanic Collaborative, and Nancy is going to be in our office. She has her own budget, her own board of directors, and her own leadership, but it's nestled right in our organization. We can't help but bump into each other. And so I'm counting on Nancy and others to hold us accountable, and I know they will. So I think it's, in our case, I think the advocacy is being willing to be open and be held accountable about what we're talking about as an imperative.
Thank you. So this is a time where it comes to get you all involved. We're going to have some time set aside for a few questions based on all of the content that was shared today, whether it was from the survey or just the individual organizations and personal journeys. So if there's any burning questions, or 2 or 3, this is now the time to participate. Nancy, I saw your hand first.
Yeah, I believe these can be, they're not available by company. I can see if they're available by industry. And I'm sure there's a clustering in certain industries that are doing better than others. But our goal here again is to learn what's working, to identify what's not working, and to move these numbers. And I think this is a great data set to hold Milwaukee accountable. I mean, it's not, because the answer is you're not going to get more diverse management talent if you're not more intentional and diverse about your recruiting, your retention, and your development of talent. So it's a good canary in the coal mine, as it were, to see how Milwaukee's doing as it moves forward on this journey.
No? Well, I didn't know if I was asking Genyne if she had.
No, I was just going to, I guess, add anecdotally from a standpoint of, who raised their hand to participate in the focus groups. So Tim mentioned, which is very rare for a study, for over 50% of those surveyed to raise their hand and say that they were willing to speak. And these focus groups were held outside of the workplace. These were not tied to people's jobs, but the numbers and sector representation was extremely diverse. So when we look at, service sector as compared to more corporate business and financial services seem to stand out just from those who raised their hand and participated in the focus groups. But I would say that because this seems to be an issue across the sectors and across different parts of the community, that I think it makes sense to take a deeper dive. But I do think that we've heard loud and clear that no matter where people were, that these issues were the same across the board.
Thank you.
And I would just add, and that is it's a good call out. That is a growing trend. I'll say within ManpowerGroup, we've looked at not only the diversity by percentage, but also looking at the functional areas. So support functions, shared services, HR, finance. Sometimes you see bigger populations of certain demographics. And so, whether it's P&L ownership or operations, that sort of a conversation and kind of, to your point, peeling the covers back on that is very important. And we've seen that a trend not only with ourselves, but partnering organizations.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am. Great question.
It's a good question that's going to deserve a longer answer than I'm going to give you. But I, from my perspective, I see our members deeply involved in education in the city because they recognize unless that improves, they're going to have a smaller pipeline coming in. And that's not an excuse for these numbers. But if Milwaukee's going to compete, it's got to get everybody on the field. And so I see a growing deep engagement in the community around, education, early childhood on up to prepare kids to be able to go on to 2-year or 4-year institutions or into an apprenticeship program because we can't continue to have, I think the number I have up there was 12% of the college graduates are African American or Hispanic. That number has to go way up. And that's not going to go way up unless we're reaching further down and we're getting more kids prepared to graduate from high school. So there's all sorts of really good question. There are all sorts of issues, tangled up in there, and it's doesn't lend itself to a quick, neat answer. But I think we get the point. We've got to be involved there.
Go ahead.
I would also add, and I touched on this a little bit to Tim's point, though. I think there's a realization that we're in a world where skills are king. Skills are the name of the game. And I think corporations are starting to be more creative, not saying that they're there yet, and to challenge their thinking around how to upskill individuals. With the ManpowerGroup, we have a program called My Path, where we're looking to not only help people with employability, but to just do that. What are the skills for tomorrow? How do we help to upskill individuals? I was having a conversation earlier around that with one of the participating members on, with their population base, how do we get some of the skills needed for the world of work tomorrow? They say by 2030, 65% of the jobs that Gen Z will be doing or millennials will be jobs that don't exist right now. So the gap is only going to widen. It's really how do we encourage learnability, how do we create a culture of learning internally, and then externally as we're looking at talent, as we see these diverse populations, how do we get creative about solutions to upskill that talent? Because I agree, education's a piece, but it will also be an evolving process. It'll be ongoing. And so we have to have those mechanisms to really upskill that talent.
Chris, who gets to name each of these new generations? You get to do that at Manpower?
I was just going to add that I think in the community, Isioma, you're also seeing a greater commitment from philanthropy to really look at racial equity and inclusion, as evidenced by Greater Milwaukee Foundation making a generational commitment to racial equity and inclusion. The Greater Milwaukee Committee that has supported the African American Leadership Alliance work just last week at the annual meeting gave an opportunity for both the Hispanic Collaborative and the African American Leadership Alliance to give updates. So you're starting to see this conversation, of course, not just happening in smaller community clusters, but also because oftentimes people who sit on the boards of philanthropy are also represented in corporate, the opportunity that we have to be able to shape what the culture is in the community and the conversation that's happening in the nonprofit space. So I'm hopeful, right, that there are these points of alignment and leverage, and we're working intentionally to ensure that, although very separate initiatives, that we continue to work with the Hispanic Collaborative to ensure that there's some best practices sharing, that we're looking at metrics in a similar way, and being able to shape a narrative that can be different from Milwaukee as well.
Last question goes to the young lady in the canary yellow blazer. Thank you for that. And I'm going to take a point of privilege before I toss it to our panelists to address that. And while I'm not a subject matter expert as the three to my right, I am an only parent to an African-American male who has a tremendous amount of statistical barriers that illustrations like this say. So I currently pay into 2 separate public school systems and still invest in private tuition. Tell me why that is fair, right? But with that, I understand from a school to prison pipeline, I understand that when you can reflect at the total employment number, when you look at the gaps of the percentage of management, this was something that I was kind of trying to sound the alarm about 10 years ago when I saw in my personal network and circle over $1 million of annual household income vacating from the city, and not just the city, from the state, where individuals that looked like me felt that they could not thrive professionally and grow in multiple different array of types of professions, whether it was attorneys, physicians, entrepreneurs, educators. Those were the individuals stabilizing the neighborhood from being able to be homeowners. They were volunteering in the local Boys and Girls Clubs, tutoring at the local elementary schools, and they were also donating to the United Way. And so when you have a base that has vacated because they feel like they can't grow and they can't flourish, and at the same time you have entities that are struggling with recruiting talent in, but then the pool that is currently here, there's a great amount of leadership that work here in the city, but then they go 12 to 15 miles either direction and aren't vested outside of the 9 to 5. And so I would say that is all intersectional with the total employment, and when you have the percentage of the management employment by race gap as well. But for our subject matter experts,
that's a great
please
answer.
Chime in.
I don't need to go further.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say it's both and, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, the next session that my friend Ron Adams will be leaving is, you know, middle management, where diversity goes to die. The reality is, you know, even if people can't get to middle management, you know, to Jasmine's point, they can't produce the income to be able to be contributors in this community. So we have an issue on both ends. It's the pipeline issue, but it also is an issue of ensuring that talent is able to rise in the ranks, to be able to compete. And because, like we mentioned, we've had the stories over and over again. Quite honestly, the focus group served as a container for many professionals who were saying, I don't have a space to even be able to talk about these things because it doesn't exist in the workplace and I don't have a place in the community, just to share with like-minded individuals how challenging it is to be in an environment where you're not supported, celebrated, and then you don't see a way to be able to move up through the ranks. So I just think it's a holistic issue which requires holistic solutions.
Well, we are at time, and before we completely adjourn, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide just some parting words and set it up more so like a call to action. Tim, I'll start with you.
So I would just say, let's follow the numbers and hold us accountable. I don't know what else to say.
That's perfect and succinct enough. Chris?
Chris?
I would, two things. From a corporation perspective, I would say the same things. I mean, you have a voice, activate your voice, hold your leadership accountable, hold your corporations accountable. You know, from our perspective and from the perspective of working with many organizations, they're well aware of the benefits, and so push them to that. But as a transplant to Milwaukee, I would challenge each of you to Genyne's point, go outside your comfort zone, go outside the networks that you normally interact with, and break bread with somebody, get to know some folks who may not look like you, may not have the same background. It can go a long way to driving impact and driving difference.
Thank you. I wanted to go last, I think, because I feel that, you know, oftentimes we go to a session like this and we really, you know, trend downward versus trending up to really be able to really talk about the simple fact that we're here for this summit with the diverse individuals who are spending half a day to be able to talk about this represents a huge change, a change in the way that Professional Dimensions is doing things. There are really awesome, great partnerships and collaborations that exist. And so it's an opportunity for us to engage in a deeper and different way. And so in order to solve this, it's going to require for us to commit to having collaborations and partnerships and allyship that we never imagined, right? So I do think that for me, the call to action is to encourage people to create a seat at the table, but also require with limited resources, we're going to have to work together to be able to move the needle for this region to become a region of choice for talent.
And wrapping up, I would just ask, really AAA, be aware. When you go back to your offices tomorrow, where do you see me? Do you see me greeting you or serving you inside your cafeteria or at a janitorial service? Even more so, where do you see other people that don't look like you around the boardrooms or in your meetings tomorrow? So first and foremost, the first A would be aware. Second is to ask questions. Tim showed a slide of all the partnering organizations and corporations. Take that information back to your prospective organizations and ask about the survey and the plan for your prospective organization and moving forward. And lastly, be authentic. And really touching upon what Chris and Genyne talked about going out your comfort zones and being authentic. So I would ask, from a call to action, go to coffee. Everybody has to eat, right? Is there anybody here that doesn't eat? Go to coffee, ask for a lunch, maybe once per quarter with somebody that doesn't look like you. And so those are the AAAs. And on behalf of ManpowerGroup and Professional Dimensions, I would like to first and foremost thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing your insights. And even more, a tremendous amount of gratitude to each and every one of you. Because when I left my house this morning and was spending 2 hours in the car, I did not know what today and this afternoon would bring. But thank each and every one of you for being here today and pressing your way and participating in our session. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Great job.